Welcome back, everybody. We're diving deep today into something I know we'll all have opinions about, how men and women see sex and relationships and like where those ideas even come from.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to me because this stuff gets at like these deep-seated societal beliefs about gender roles. Like we all have these expectations.
Totally. And we're not here to like judge or say who's right or wrong in this, this battle of the sexes thing. It's more about understanding like what are people even saying? What are they basing these arguments on and maybe make you think twice about your own ideas about relationships.
Absolutely. It's about like critical thinking and broadening our understanding. Relationships are complicated.
Okay, so one of the most like I don't know, eyebrow-raising things we came across was this idea of duty in relationships. Like, we heard arguments that men have a duty to protect and provide, right, traditional stuff. But for women, it gets interesting. Their duty is supposedly to uh, provide sexual satisfaction.
Yeah, like literally the phrase was a woman's duty is her booty. I mean, on the surface, that sounds so outdated, right?
Yeah.
But like if we dig a little deeper, it kind of shows you this very like traditional and transactional view of relationships.
So it's like this agreement. Men do the provider-protector thing, and women, well, they have to take care of things in the bedroom.
Exactly. But this whole framework ignores like emotional connection and desire, and like individual choice. It makes relationships all about these predefined roles and obligations, which can be really limiting, even damaging.
And the women in these discussions definitely push back. They were like, hold on, relationships should be built on respect, safety, meeting each other's needs, not just playing these roles.
Right. They were firm that intimacy should come from mutual desire and connection, not obligation. They challenged the idea that a woman's satisfaction is her sole responsibility or like a trade-off for a man doing his duties.
And they had some good examples too, like one woman talked about how feeling unsafe or like her boundaries were crossed would obviously affect her desire to be intimate. She really emphasized needing emotional security and respect in a relationship.
Which is so important. It shows how connected emotional well-being is to physical intimacy. It challenges this idea that sex is separate from everything else going on in the relationship. And it makes you think about how men can better understand and respond to women's need for emotional safety and respect.
Instead of just dismissing those feelings as like temporary or irrational, which is what some of the men in these conversations did, we should be encouraging open communication and empathy.
Exactly. Dismissing your partner's emotional needs builds resentment. Communication breaks down, and ultimately, it hurts the whole relationship.
Which leads us perfectly into this other debate that came up. Monogamy versus wanting variety. This is where things get really interesting.
Oh, yeah, we heard from some of the men that they're like biologically wired for multiple partners, while women are naturally more into one high quality partner.
So is this nature versus nurture? Is monogamy just a societal thing, or is there like an evolutionary reason for these different desires?
That's the big question, isn't it? The men we looked at pointed to things like men being visually stimulated by variety, suggesting that's just an innate male trait.
Oh, yeah. They even used the example of music videos with lots of women to make their point, like saying it caters to what men supposedly find visually appealing.
But that ignores how much society and culture shape us. The media we consume, messages from peers, expectations from our social structures, all play a huge role in what we desire and how we behave.
So it's not as simple as men are programmed for variety, women for monogamy.
Exactly. There's this interplay of biology, psychology, and social factors. It's important to remember that generalizing about entire genders is misleading and reinforces stereotypes.
This is where that whole easy mode comment popped up, right? Some of the men said women have it easier in dating because there's less competition.
Right, and that reflects this broader societal idea that relationships are a breeze for women, but it totally overlooks the pressures and double standards women face and all the emotional labor and challenges they often navigate in relationships.
Like what, for example?
Well, women are often expected to be more nurturing, more emotionally expressive and accommodating in relationships. They may feel pressure to put their partner's needs before their own, and let's not forget the societal expectations around beauty and physical appearance women deal with constantly.
It's a good reminder to look at the whole picture and not make sweeping judgments about people based on their gender.
Absolutely. And this leads us to another big theme, power dynamics and respect in relationships.
This is where things got intense. We heard claims that women only respect men who can just walk away, and that they only respond to ultimatums.
Yeah, and those statements reflect a belief system where power and control are seen as key to attraction and respect. Some of the men we studied were all about tactics like walking away, withholding financial support, even ultimatums to assert dominance and get what they wanted from women.
They even give examples of kicking women out for refusing sex or not paying bills until certain demands were met. It's a pretty intense perspective, and the women in these conversations definitely pushed back against these power dynamics.
Yeah, they highlighted how dangerous and unhealthy those kinds of power imbalances can be in relationships. They argued that real respect and attraction should come from mutual understanding, empathy, and compromise, not coercion and manipulation.
So how do we even begin to reconcile these drastically different views on power dynamics in relationships? What does it mean for people who aren't in relationships where this kind of imbalance exists?
These are really important questions that we need to think carefully about. We need to examine how these power dynamics connect to bigger societal issues of gender inequality and control. And we have to understand what the consequences are for both men and women in relationships where power isn't shared equally.
And that's exactly what we're going to get into next.
We'll be looking at how these power dynamics play out in real-life situations and examining the impact they have on communication trust and overall relationship satisfaction.
So stay tuned because we're about to unpack some of the most challenging parts of this conversation.
These power dynamics, they really mess with communication in a relationship, you
Yeah.
know? We saw how some of the men were like, communication is just a tool to get what I want, not really about connection.
Yeah, they were all about being like super assertive, almost aggressive, using ultimatums and strong arm tactics.
Totally different from what some of the women described, right? They wanted open, honest dialogue where you can share your feelings and needs without being judged or attacked.
One woman in particular, she talked about needing time to process her emotions, needing a safe space to share how she feels. She explained how she grew up in a big family, so it took a while for her to feel comfortable opening up and being vulnerable.
Her story just shows how crucial it is to understand and respect different communication styles. When she tried to talk about her feelings, the men in these conversations just totally dismissed and misunderstood her.
Yeah, they were like, oh, those are just temporary feelings, irrational.
hmm
Maybe she's overreacting. It was obvious they didn't get how important it was for her to process her emotions and feel heard.
And that's a classic relationship pitfall, right? People have such different ways of expressing themselves emotionally and communicating. If you're not willing to bridge that gap, to misunderstandings and conflicts are bound to happen.
So how do we bridge that gap? Is it all about compromise, or is there a better way to deal with these differences in communication styles?
It starts with realizing there's no right or wrong way to communicate. It's
Mm.
about empathy, active listening, meeting your partner where they're at emotionally. It's also understanding that emotions, even the ones that seem irrational or fleeting, are valid and need to be acknowledged.
That makes sense. When you dismiss or invalidate your partner's feelings, you break down trust and create distance. It's about building a space where both people feel safe and respected enough to be themselves.
Yeah, and that takes us to another important part of this conversation, the role of sex in a relationship.
Mm.
We saw a huge difference in how men and women viewed this.
Big time, for some of the men. Sex was tied to that whole duty and reward thing. They seemed to focus on quantity and variety, like saying men are just biologically driven to want multiple partners.
It was a very transactional view of sex, like it's something to be earned or traded.
And the women were more about quality and intimacy over just numbers. They talked about the importance of feeling emotionally connected, desired, respected, and experiencing pleasure in a safe and trusting environment.
It really highlights the complexity of female sexuality. It challenges this simplistic idea that sex for women is just about physical gratification or fulfilling an obligation. It's about feeling emotionally connected, respected, and experiencing pleasure that goes beyond just the physical.
It's clear that these different views on sex can cause a lot of problems in a relationship if you don't talk about them openly and honestly.
Absolutely. When partners have such different expectations and understandings of sex, it can lead to misunderstandings, resentment, and feeling unfulfilled.
So how do we navigate these differences? How do we find common ground when it comes to something so personal and potentially sensitive?
Open and honest communication is essential. Partners need to be willing to share their desires, fears, and expectations without shame or judgment. It's also about being willing to understand and respect your partner's perspective, even if it's different from yours.
And maybe challenging some of those deep-seated societal beliefs about sex and gender roles that we talked about before.
Exactly. Examining those underlying assumptions and expectations can help break free from these limiting and potentially harmful narratives about what it means to be a man or a woman in a relationship.
And that brings us to a really big question. If these traditional notions of duty, monogamy, and power dynamics are being challenged, what new model of relationships is emerging?
That's the question we'll be exploring as we head into the final part of our deep dive. We'll be looking at how relationships are evolving and considering what values and principles can guide us toward more fulfilling and equitable partnerships.
I feel like we've uncovered way more questions than answers. But isn't that what makes these deep dives so interesting?
Totally. Wrestling with these tough questions is how we get to healthier, more fulfilling relationships. It's not about easy answers, it's about understanding.
So true. So let's talk about this new model for relationships that's supposedly emerging. What does it even look like? What are the important values?
It's a model that ditches those rigid roles and expectations, and it's more about flexibility and individuality, recognizing that both partners have needs and desires and aspirations that should be respected.
So not looking at relationships as duty and obligation,
Yeah.
it's more about mutual respect, collaboration, genuinely wanting to support each other's growth.
Exactly. Creating a partnership where both people feel empowered to be themselves and their contributions are valued equally.
That sounds amazing.
hmm
But how do we actually make that happen? What are some things we can do to build those kinds of relationships?
Communication is huge. Open, honest, respectful communication is the foundation of any good relationship. Partners need to feel safe to express their needs and desires and concerns without judgment.
And it's not just talking, it's listening. Really listening and trying to understand your partner's perspective even when you disagree.
Exactly. Empathy and active listening are so key. It's about putting yourself in your partner's shoes, seeing the world from their side.
It also seems like we need to let go of those traditional power dynamics.
You got it. Moving away from control and manipulation and towards collaboration and empowering each other is key. Recognizing that both partners have equal value and deserve to be heard.
So instead of trying to win arguments or be the boss, it's about finding solutions that work for both of you.
Right. It's approaching conflict as a chance to grow and understand each other, not a battle to be won or lost.
Sounds like this new model takes a real shift in thinking.
For sure, it challenges those deep-seated societal beliefs about gender roles and expectations. We need to embrace vulnerability and open communication, be willing to let go of control, and be more collaborative in love and partnership.
It's a challenge, but ultimately a rewarding one, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. These kinds of relationships take effort and being intentional, but the payoff is huge. A deeper connection, more intimacy, a more fulfilling partnership. It's worth it.
And what about sex in this new model? How does that fit in?
Sex becomes an expression of intimacy and connection and mutual pleasure, not a duty or something you bargain with. It's about celebrating each other's bodies, desires, and boundaries.
So we're moving away from that transactional thinking
Mm.
and towards a more holistic, fulfilling approach to intimacy.
You got it, recognizing that sex is just one part of a multifaceted relationship, and real intimacy is about emotional, physical, and intellectual connection.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive. We've covered so much and really challenged some common ideas about relationships as we wrap up. What's the main thing you want listeners to think about?
The biggest takeaway is that relationships are always changing. There's no one right way to do it. The key is being open to learning, growing, and adapting with your partner. It's embracing the complexities and challenges of love with honesty, compassion, and a willingness to create a partnership that truly nourishes both people.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I think that's a perfect way to end it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the ever-changing world of relationships. Until next time, keep those conversations going, question those assumptions, and remember, love is a journey, not a destination.